There is a moment in this story that I still find hard to picture properly, even after reading the reports. A single American fighter, alone, 5 miles above a German factory town. Around it, more than 30 enemy aircraft. And the man in the cockpit is pushing the firing switch on his control column and getting nothing back. No recoil. No smell of cordite through the cracked ventilation. 4 Browning 50 caliber machine guns in the wings, and by that point in the fight, most of them are dead metal. He keeps attacking anyway. He climbs, picks out a German fighter lining up on a bomber, rolls over, and comes down on it at 400 miles an hour with an empty airplane. And the German breaks. Every single time, the German breaks. Because from a quarter-mile away, through a canopy scratched by frost and gun gas, you cannot tell whether the fighter diving on you has ammunition or not. All you can see is a Mustang coming, and the only thing your training says is that if you do not move right now, you will be dead in 3 seconds. That went on for something like half an hour. The pilot's name was James Howell Howard. He was 30 years old, he had been born in China, and by the end of that day, he had done something that got him the only Medal of Honor ever awarded to a fighter pilot in the European theater who lived long enough to wear it. But this is not only a story about one man being brave, and I think that is the part that usually gets lost. January the 11th, 1944 mattered because of what the German pilots learned that morning. Not about Howard, about the airplane he was flying. For 2 years, the Luftwaffe had fought the American daylight bombing campaign with a plan so simple you could explain it to a new pilot in about 90 seconds. Wait. Just wait. Let the American escort fighters burn their fuel. Watch them turn for home somewhere over the Dutch border, because they always turned for home. Then take your time, get above the bombers, and pull them apart at your leisure. That plan had killed hundreds of American aircrew. It worked at Regensburg. It worked catastrophically well at Schweinfurt. It was, by the autumn of 1943, close to winning the air war outright. On the morning of January the 11th, the escorts did not turn for home. That is the whole story, in a sentence. Everything else is how it happened, and what it cost. To understand why one aircraft type could tilt a war, you have to understand what the Americans believed before it arrived, because they believed it very hard, and a lot of young men died proving it wrong. The idea had been worked out in the 1930s, mostly at the Air Corps Tactical School in Alabama, by officers who were absolutely certain of it. Bombing in daylight, from high altitude, using the Norden bomb site, hitting not cities but specific things. Ball-bearing plants, aircraft factories, synthetic oil refineries. Cut the tendons of an industrial economy and the arm stops working, and you win without another SOM. The catch was survival, and the American answer to that was the formation itself. Put your bombers into a tight block, stacked in layers, so that every angle of approach ran into overlapping fields of fire from a dozen aircraft at once. A single B-17 carried up to 13 heavy machine guns. A combat box of 18 of them carried well over 200. On paper, a formation like that was a flying fortress in the literal sense, and the name stuck for a reason. The Royal Air Force had tried something similar in 1939 and given it up almost immediately. They sent unescorted bombers against German naval targets in daylight, lost most of them in a matter of minutes, and switched to night operations, where you cannot hit a factory, but at least you can usually find your way back to England. When the Americans arrived in 1942 talking about precision daylight bombing, the British thought they were about to relearn a very expensive lesson. They were right, and it took about a year for the bill to arrive. The first raids, in the summer of 1942, were short-range attacks on targets in France and the Low Countries, and they went reasonably well. Escorted by Spitfires, flying against a German fighter force that was mostly deployed elsewhere, the 8th Air Force lost few aircraft and drew exactly the wrong conclusion from it. The theory looked sound. Nobody had yet tested it where it would actually be tested, which was deep inside Germany, without fighters, against the whole weight of the Reich's air defense. That test came on the 17th of August, 1943, and again on the 14th of October. The August mission was a double strike, Regensburg and Schweinfurt on the same day. It cost 60 bombers, 60 crews, 600 men, more or less, in a single afternoon. October was worse because by then everyone knew what was waiting. 291 fortresses set out for the ball-bearing works at Schweinfurt on the 14th of October, 1943. The escorts, Thunderbolts, went with them as far as they could and turned back near Aachen. What happened after that is one of the ugliest few hours in the history of aerial warfare. German fighters attacked in relays, landing, rearming, and taking off again to hit the same formation on its way home. Twin-engine Messerschmitts stood off beyond machine gun range and fired rocket mortars into the boxes to blow them open. Then single-engine fighters came in through the gap. 60 bombers were lost. Another 140-odd came home damaged, some of them so badly they never flew again. Around 650 men did not come back. The crews called it Black Thursday, and they were not being dramatic. Do the arithmetic that every airman in England was doing that week. A tour was 25 missions. If you lose 10% of the force on every raid, the chance of any individual crew finishing 25 is roughly 7%. Statistically, the odds said you were going to die, and everybody in the Nissen huts of East Anglia understood the odds perfectly well. They kept flying. That is the part I find genuinely hard to sit with. They kept getting up at 4 in the morning and walking out to the hard stands knowing the mathematics were against them. What they could not keep doing was this particular version of the war. The 8th Air Force suspended deep penetration raids into Germany after Schweinfurt. Not officially, not with an announcement, but the missions stopped going past the range of the fighters because there was no point pretending anymore. The self-defending bomber formation had been tested to destruction, and it had failed. Lieutenant General Ira Eaker, who commanded the 8th, had spent 2 years arguing for this campaign against a lot of people who thought it would not work. He was not a fool, and he was not stubborn for the sake of it. He had simply run out of the one thing that would fix the problem, which was a fighter that could go where the bombers went. And here is the part that seems almost unbelievable in hindsight. Nobody had built one, because the doctrine said it could not be built. The reasoning went like this. A fighter that carries enough fuel to fly to Berlin and back has to be big, and if it is big, it is heavy, and if it is heavy, it will be slaughtered by a small light interceptor that only has to climb 10,000 feet from its own runway. Range and agility were understood to be opposites. You could have one. Nobody in any air force in the world had figured out how to have both. The Americans had 2 excellent fighters in England by late 1943, and neither of them solved it. The P-47 Thunderbolt was an enormous, brutally strong machine built around a 2,000 horsepower radial engine and a turbo supercharger that made it superb above 25,000 feet. It could outdive anything in the sky. It could absorb damage that would have torn any other fighter apart. What it could not do was go very far, because that huge engine drank fuel at a rate that made staff officers wince. Even hung with drop tanks, a Thunderbolt in late 1943 could get as far as the German frontier and then had to turn around. The P-38 Lightning had the legs. Twin engines, a distinctive twin-boom layout, genuinely long range. But the Lightning had problems in the cold, thin air over northern Europe that it never had over the Pacific. Its Allison engines threw connecting rods in the deep cold. Its cockpit heating was close to useless, and pilots came home with frostbite. It had compressibility trouble in high-speed dives, which is exactly the situation an escort pilot keeps finding himself in. And there were never enough of them, because the Mediterranean and the Pacific had first call. So the shape of the problem in December 1943 was this. The bombers had to go deep, because the targets that mattered were deep. Beyond a line drawn roughly through western Germany, they went alone. The Luftwaffe knew exactly where that line was, and it waited on the far side of it. The thing that broke that arrangement had been sitting around for 3 years, half ignored, mostly by accident. In the spring of 1940, with France collapsing and the Battle of Britain a few weeks away, a British purchasing commission arrived in California looking for airframes. Any airframes. They walked into North American Aviation in Inglewood, a company that up to that point was mainly known for building trainers, and asked whether it could build Curtiss P-40 Warhawks under license. James Kindleberger, who ran North American, told them no. Then he made them an offer that on the face of it sounds like salesmanship bordering on lunacy. Rather than build somebody else's obsolescent fighter, his people would design a completely new one, from a blank sheet, and have a prototype ready in 4 months. The British took it. They had nothing to lose and no time to be careful. North American's design team, led by Edgar Schmood, put an airframe together in 102 days. Not a flying aircraft, which took longer, but a complete airframe rolled out of the shop on time, and that alone is a small miracle of industrial organization. What they built was unusual in several ways. It had a very slim fuselage. It used a laminar flow wing, a new aerofoil section developed with the NACA that had its point of maximum thickness much further back than normal, which cut drag at high speed and had never been put into mass production before. And it had its radiator buried in a scoop under the rear fuselage, with a duct shaped so that the hot air leaving the back of it actually produced a small amount of thrust, which partly cancelled out the drag of the cooling system. It flew in October 1940. The RAF named it the Mustang, took delivery, and then discovered the flaw. The engine was an Allison V1710, and the Allison was a perfectly decent piece of engineering with a single-stage supercharger, which meant it made good power down low and lost it badly above about 15,000 feet. Fighters in Europe fought high. A Mustang at 25,000 feet was slower than the Spitfires already in service, and the whole beautiful airframe was being throttled by what was bolted to the front of it. So the RAF put it to work at low level. Armed reconnaissance, tactical work over France, ground attack. Useful, unglamorous, nowhere near what the thing was capable of. The American Army Air Forces looked at it, saw an aircraft nobody in Britain was using as an interceptor, and ordered a batch as a dive bomber. That version was called the A-36 Apache. In late 1942, if you had said the Mustang would decide the air war over Germany, people who knew aircraft would have laughed at you. What changed it was one test flight in April 1942. Ronald Harker was a test pilot working for Rolls-Royce. He went down to Duxford, flew a Mustang Mark I for about 30 minutes, and wrote a report afterwards that is one of the great short documents of the war. He said the airframe was outstanding, better handling than anything comparable he had flown, excellent visibility, beautifully harmonized controls. And then he made the suggestion that mattered: put a Merlin 61 in it. The Merlin 61 was the two-stage, two-speed supercharged version of the engine that powered the Spitfire. It held its power at altitude instead of losing it. Rolls-Royce ran the numbers, and the numbers were so good that people assumed somebody had made an arithmetic mistake. They had not. Conversions were flying by the autumn of 1942, and North American built their own Merlin engine prototypes in America, using the version that Packard was manufacturing under license in Detroit. The result was an aeroplane that had no right to exist under the doctrine everyone believed. It did well over 400 miles an hour at altitude. It climbed hard. It turned with anything the Germans had. And because of that low-drag wing and a genuinely efficient airframe, it did all of that while burning fuel at a rate that let it fly to Berlin, fight, and come home. With 2 drop tanks under the wings and a fuselage tank added in later models, its combat radius was more than double a Thunderbolt's. Range and performance were not opposites after all. They had just needed a very clean airframe and the right supercharger, and it took a British test pilot in a borrowed American airplane to notice. Production of the Merlin-powered version, the P-51B, started at Inglewood in the middle of 1943. The first aircraft reached England in November. Which brings us to the second half of the equation, because an aeroplane is only as good as the man strapped into it, and the man who is about to matter here had already fought an entire war on the other side of the world. James Howell. Howard was born on the 8th of April 1913 in Canton in southern China. His father was an American eye surgeon who taught at the Canton Christian College. Howard spent his childhood there. He picked up Chinese from the people around him. He watched warlord armies move through the city during the chaos of the 1920s, and he grew up with a sense of how quickly an ordered world can come apart, which is not something most American boys of his generation had any reason to learn. The family came back to the United States. He went to Pomona College in California, then joined the Navy, and earned his wings at Pensacola. By 1941, he was flying fighters off the carrier Enterprise, which was about as good a job as a young American aviator could have. Then a recruiter came around with a strange proposition. A retired Army captain named Claire Chennault was quietly hiring American military pilots to fly for the Chinese government against Japan, under contract, for money that was roughly 3 times service pay. The whole thing existed in a gray area that the American government preferred not to discuss. Officially, these men were resigning to work for a civilian aircraft company. Howard resigned his commission and went. The unit was the American Volunteer Group, and the world would end up calling them the Flying Tigers. They flew Curtiss P-40s, which were outclassed by the Japanese fighters they faced in almost every respect, except 2. They were tough, and they were fast in a dive. Chennault taught his pilots to stop trying to dogfight and to fight vertically instead. Get above the enemy. Come down, fire, keep going. Do not turn with a 0, because you will lose. Do not try to be gallant, because gallantry gets you killed, and the airplane is more valuable than your pride. Howard flew combat over Burma and southern China within 2 weeks of Pearl Harbor. He shot down 6 Japanese aircraft. More importantly for what is coming, he learned a way of fighting that suited his temperament exactly. He was patient. He saw things early. He fired in short bursts at close range rather than spraying at distance, and he broke off before the counterattack came. He also learned to say almost nothing about any of it, a habit that never left him. The AVG was disbanded on the 4th of July, 1942, and absorbed into the American forces in China. Howard came home instead, took a captain's commission in the Army Air Forces, made major, and in the summer of 1943 was given command of the 356th Fighter Squadron in a brand new outfit forming up in the Midwest. The 354th Fighter Group. In November 1943, the 354th arrived at Boxted in Essex and found out what they would be flying. They were the first American group in Europe to receive the P-51B, which earned them a nickname they kept for the rest of the war, the Pioneer Mustang Group. And here is a wrinkle in this story that I think is genuinely funny, in a bleak military kind of way. The 354th did not belong to the 8th Air Force. It belonged to the 9th. The 8th was the strategic force, the one flying heavy bombers into Germany, the one desperate for long-range escort, the one whose crews were dying for the lack of it. The 9th was the tactical air force being assembled to support the invasion of France. Fighter bombers, medium bombers, close air support for troops. Escorting fortresses over central Germany was nobody's idea of a 9th Air Force job. But the Mustangs had gone to the 9th, and the 8th had none. And so an arrangement was made. The 354th would stay on the 9th's books administratively while operating under 8th Fighter Command for escort work, until the 8th's own Mustang groups arrived. Everyone assumed that would be a matter of weeks. So the first American unit to take the Mustang into combat over Europe was, technically, on loan from the wrong Air Force, doing a job it had not been formed to do. They needed someone to show them how. 8th Fighter Command sent over Lieutenant Colonel Don Blakesley of the 4th Fighter Group, an experienced combat leader who flew the group's first missions with them in December while they learned. Their early sorties over France and the Low Countries were cautious. The aircraft had teething trouble, guns jammed, engines ran rough, radios were poor. None of which changed the one fact that mattered, which was that these aeroplanes could go where nothing else could. The other change came at the top. On the 6th of January, 1944, Lieutenant General James Doolittle took command of the 8th Air Force. Eaker went to the Mediterranean. Doolittle was not a conventional officer. He had been a barnstormer and a racing pilot in the 1920s, the first man to fly an aircraft blind on instruments alone, and he held a doctorate in aeronautical engineering from MIT, which he earned while serving in the Army. Most people knew him for one thing: leading 16 B-25s off the deck of the carrier Hornet in April 1942 to bomb Tokyo, a raid that did almost no physical damage and changed the mood of an entire country. He was also, unusually for a senior commander in 1944, someone who genuinely understood the engineering and the mathematics of what he was being asked to do. He looked at Schweinfurt the way an engineer looks at a failed structure. The theory had a flaw in it. The flaw needed fixing, and he did not much care whose reputation was attached to the old theory. He had 5 days before the next deep mission. The target list for that mission had been chosen months earlier, and it never changed because it could not. In the last week of 1943, the combined chiefs had made destruction of the German fighter force the top priority of the bombing campaign, ahead of everything else, because without air superiority, there would be no invasion of France in the spring. Which meant going after the factories that built German fighters, which meant flying to precisely the places most heavily defended by German fighters. There was a horrible circular logic to it that nobody could get out of. To destroy the Luftwaffe, you had to give the Luftwaffe something it had to defend. The bombers were the bait. Everybody involved understood that, including the crews. On the 10th of January, the weathermen said there would be a gap over central Germany the following morning. Mission 182 briefed at 5 in the morning on Tuesday the 11th of January, 1944, in rooms scattered across more than 40 airfields in eastern England. You know the image even if you have never seen a photograph of it. Wooden benches, a haze of cigarette smoke, men in flying clothing holding tin mugs, and a covered map at the front. The intelligence officer pulls the cloth off, and the whole room reads the red ribbon at once and makes a noise. Sometimes a groan. Sometimes, on the very bad ones, nothing at all. The ribbon went east across the North Sea, over the Dutch coast, and kept going. Past the Ruhr, past the usual turning points. It ended at 3 places in central Germany, none of which most of these men had heard of before that morning. Oschersleben, where the AGO Flugzeugwerke was one of the largest producers of Focke-Wulf 190 fighters left in Germany. Halberstadt, where a Junkers plant made components for bombers. And Brunswick, where the Wagenfabrik works were turning out Messerschmitt 110s, the twin-engined machines that carried the rocket tubes that had been ripping American formations apart since the previous summer. The men in those rooms were being sent to bomb the factories building the aircraft that would be shooting at them on the way in. They noticed. Somebody always says it out loud. 663 heavy bombers were dispatched in 3 divisions. Thunderbolts and Lightnings would cover the route in relays as far as their fuel allowed. And then, at the deepest point of the penetration, over the target itself, 49 Mustangs of the 354th Fighter Group would be waiting. 49 fighters. That is the number I keep coming back to. 49, for the deepest raid the 8th Air Force had yet attempted, because that was every long-range escort fighter available in the entire European theater that morning. At Boxted, Colonel Kenneth Martin briefed his group. Martin was 33, a career fighter pilot, and this was the mission he had spent a decade preparing for. Major James Howard sat in the room with the rest of them and listened. Takeoff began around 7:30. If you have ever been on an English airfield in January before dawn, you have some idea of what that was like. Frost on the grass, mist lying in the hollows, and then the noise. 4 Wright Cyclones on one bomber is loud. 663 bombers spooling up across East Anglia is something else, a sound that people living under those fields remembered for the rest of their lives. They formed up in slow spirals over the North Sea, climbed to 20,000 feet and above, and crossed into occupied Europe a little after 9. And then the weather forecast fell apart. The gap that had been promised over Germany was not there. Cloud was building up ahead of the formations, higher than the bombers could climb, and the assembly began to come apart in it. Groups lost sight of each other. Escorts lost their bombers. At headquarters in England, the operations staff looked at what was coming back over the wireless and made the call. Recall. The 2nd Bombardment Division, heading for Brunswick, turned around. The 3rd Division, heading for Halberstadt, turned around. Both went home, and both are largely forgotten in this story, which is a shame for the men who flew them, because turning a formation of heavy bombers around inside hostile airspace is not a safe thing to do either. The 1st Bombardment Division did not turn around. At its head flew Brigadier General Robert Travis, 39 years old, a West Point graduate from Georgia, one of the youngest generals in the American Air Arm, and a man with a reputation for flying the missions himself rather than watching them come back. The recall reached him. He had, by most accounts, some discretion in how he read it. He looked at where he was, and how far it was to Oschersleben, and how far it was home. He thought about what happens when you break up a defensive formation and reverse it in the middle of German airspace with fighters already coming up, and he decided to press on. 238 bombers went with him. People have argued about that decision for 80 years, and I do not think there is a clean answer. If the target had been missed, or the losses even heavier, Travis would be remembered as the man who ignored a recall and got his crews killed. As it happened, the bombing at Oschersleben was good. The factory was badly damaged, and 60 American bombers still did not come home. Both of those things are true at once. That is usually how it goes. While the recall was being read, the Luftwaffe was already climbing. Fighters from Jagdgeschwader 1, JG-3, JG-11, and JG-26 came up from fields across northern Germany, along with the Zerstörer units flying twin-engined 110S and 410S. This was a maximum effort, close to 500 sorties over the course of the day, and the plan was the plan it had always been. The rocket-armed twin-engine fighters would climb above the bomber stream and stand off outside the range of the American gunners. Each carried 2 Werfer Granit 21 tubes under the wings, firing a 21-centimeter mortar shell with a time fuse. You did not need to hit anything. You needed to burst a shell inside a formation and open it up. Then the single-engined fighters came through the hole and worked on the stragglers. At the expected moment, the Thunderbolts began to turn for home. Fuel. Nothing to be done about it. The American formations watched their escort peel away west, one squadron after another, and braced. The Zerstörer crews leveled off above the bombers and began setting up their firing runs. Then the Mustangs came down through the cloud. I want to be careful here, because there is a version of this story where 49 fighters sweep the sky clean and everyone goes home, and that is not what happened. 60 bombers were lost that day. It was, by raw numbers, one of the costliest missions the 8th ever flew. What happened was narrower than a victory and more important than one. What happened was that the German pilots discovered they could not get away. Colonel Martin led the group in and picked out a Messerschmitt 110 near Halberstadt. He closed on it from behind and opened fire. The German broke. Martin followed him down, and the 2 aircraft collided. Whether it was a misjudged overtake at high closing speed or a deliberate ram has never been settled, and the people who might have known did not agree with each other afterwards. Martin got out. He came down by parachute into German hands and spent the next 16 months a prisoner. The Pioneer Mustang Group had lost its commanding officer inside the first few minutes, and most of its pilots did not know it for hours. Across 100 miles of sky, the fight came apart into dozens of separate ones. And in each of them, German pilots started doing the things that had always worked, and found they no longer worked. Split S and dive away. The Mustang followed. Climb hard on a Focke-Wulf's brutal rate of climb. The Mustang was still there. Roll out at 30,000 feet and open the throttle, which had always been enough to leave a Thunderbolt behind, and the Mustang was closing. Then there was the thing that broke their model of the war entirely. Aircraft that could reach the sky over Oschersleben should not have had the fuel to fight there. Every German pilot flying that day had been trained on an assumption about where American fighters ran out of range, and that assumption had just stopped being true, and there had been no announcement. Several German pilots wrote about it later, and the accounts have an odd consistency. Not fear exactly, more a sort of vertigo. Men realizing in the space of about 90 seconds that a piece of arithmetic they had built their survival on was wrong. In the middle of all that, one Mustang lost its formation. Howard had made a firing pass on a 110 climbing towards the bombers, hit it, and watched it fall away burning. Then he pulled up looking for his wingmen and found empty sky. In a fight that size, spread over that much airspace, at those speeds, losing your flight takes about 4 seconds and there is no reliable way to find them again. The radio was useless, everyone talking over everyone else. He was alone at altitude with maybe half his fuel gone. And below him, he could see the 1st Division still driving east towards Oschersleben in a long line, and coming down on it from the north, in loose groups, German fighters. He started counting and gave it up somewhere around 30. There were no other American fighters anywhere near them. Now, the honest thing to say here is that nobody knows exactly what went through his head, because Howard never really told anyone, and when asked directly, he tended to give the shortest possible answer and change the subject. What is on the record is what he did, which was to push the nose down and go at them by himself. The bombers he dropped into were the 401st Bombardment Group out of Deenathorpe. A tail gunner spotted a fighter falling out of the sun and called it, and then realized what he was watching. One P-51 going the wrong way into 30-odd Germans. Howard's first target was a Focke-Wulf 190 setting up on the lead ship. He closed and fired, and 2 of his 4 guns worked. That was the Mustang's ugly secret in early 1944. The P-51B's wing was thin, and to fit the guns inside it they were mounted canted over on their sides. Under heavy G loading the ammunition belts twisted in the feed chutes, and the guns stopped. It was a known problem. It got fixed later with electric feed boosters, and eventually with a redesigned wing. But on the 11th of January, it was still there, and Howard was flying an aeroplane that was disarming itself a little more with every hard turn he made. He hit the 190 anyway, and it broke off. He turned inside another one, fired, hit the engine, watched the pilot go over the side. He kept going. Somewhere in the next 20 minutes the guns quit one at a time until he had none. And he kept making passes. That is the whole thing. He would climb, pick out whichever German was closest to doing damage, roll in on him and come down, and the German would break away. Because from where that pilot sat, a Mustang diving on him from above is a Mustang diving on him from above. There is no way to look at an aeroplane and see that its ammunition boxes are empty. For something in the region of half an hour, one man kept a bomber formation alive largely by bluff. I find that more impressive than if his guns had worked, honestly. If your guns work, you are fighting. If they do not, and you keep flying at people anyway, you are just standing in front of them and daring them to call it. The crews of the 400 first watched the whole thing through scratched perspex from a few thousand feet below. They could not talk to him. They did not know who he was. What they could see, when he came close enough, was a marking on the side of the fuselage below the cockpit. 2 Chinese characters in yellow. Ding Hao. It was Flying Tiger slang, picked up in China, meaning something close to the very best. Howard had it painted on every aeroplane he flew. The bombing went in. The doors opened over Oschersleben. The AGO works took a serious pounding, and the formation swung west for home. Howard went with them, sitting out on the flank, low on fuel, with no ammunition and a few cannon holes in his aircraft, and he stayed there until the last German broke off near the Dutch coast. All told, he had been in continuous action for close to 40 minutes, and had made, by the count of the men watching, at least 6 attacking passes. 60 bombers did not come home that day. The 401st lost 4. Given what was thrown at them and how long they were alone with it, that number should have been very much worse, and the men in that formation were in no doubt about why it was not. He landed at Boxted in the middle of the afternoon and walked into the debriefing hut looking like a tired man who had done a day's work. He told the intelligence officer that he had got separated, found some bombers in trouble, and done what he could. He thought he had shot down 2, possibly a 3rd. He was not certain. Then he asked whether the bombers had made it back, which nobody could tell him yet, and went to find something to eat. 40 miles north at Deenathorpe, Colonel Harold Bowman was listening to his surviving crews say the same thing over and over. There was a Mustang. One Mustang. It stayed with us through the target. It would not leave. Bowman started telephoning fighter bases, asking whether anyone had a pilot who had been over Oschersleben alone in a Mustang with Chinese writing on the side. Boxted said yes. A New York Times correspondent came out the following week. Howard sat through the interview because he had been told to, gave short answers, and when asked what he had been thinking while attacking 30 aircraft on his own, said he had seen a job that needed doing. Asked if he had been frightened, he said he had been too busy. The story ran on the 19th of January, and by the next morning he was famous in a way he never got comfortable with. Letters started arriving from mothers of bomber crewmen. He answered some of them and never really knew what to say. The Medal of Honor came in June 1944, pinned on by General Karl Spaatz on an airfield in England. Howard remains the only fighter pilot in the European theater to receive it and survive. The citation was not built out of his own account, because he had barely written one. It was assembled from the statements of the bomber crews who had watched him from the waist windows and the top turrets. That is a detail worth sitting with. The medal was made almost entirely out of other men's gratitude. What happened to the air war after that was faster than anyone expected. Late in January, Doolittle went to 8th Fighter Command and gave an order that horrified a lot of people. American fighters would no longer be tied to the bombers they were escorting. They would be released to sweep ahead of the stream, hunt German fighters wherever they found them, and on the way home shoot up anything on the ground, including airfields. There is a story, probably polished in the retelling, about him taking down a sign at fighter headquarters that read, "The first duty of 8th Air Force fighters is to bring the bombers back alive." Bomber crews hated it. They wanted their little friends where they could see them. Doolittle's reasoning was cold and correct. As long as the fighters flew defensively, the Luftwaffe picked the time and place of every fight, and anyone who picks their fights survives. Take that choice away, and the German fighter force has to come up on somebody else's terms, and then it starts to die. In late February came Big Week, 6 days of sustained attacks on the German aircraft industry, with everything England could put in the air. The Luftwaffe had to defend it, and the Mustangs were waiting. On the 4th of March, American fighters were over Berlin for the first time. On the 6th, the first full-scale raid on the capital cost 69 bombers, and killed a good number of German fighters as well, and there was nowhere left in Germany that was safe to be. The numbers underneath all of this are the real story. German fighter production did not collapse. Dispersed into workshops and forests and tunnels, it actually peaked in September 1944 at more than 3,000 aircraft in a month. What collapsed was the supply of pilots. A German fighter pilot reaching his squadron in 1942 had something like 250 hours of flying training. By late 1944, that had fallen under 100, and in some cases far under, while his American opponent turned up with over 300, and often much more. Germany was not short of aeroplanes. It was short of anyone left alive who could fly them properly, and the ones who could were being killed over their own country by escorts that would not turn back. Adolf Galland, who commanded the German fighter arm and watched it happen, put it plainly after the war. What broke the Luftwaffe was not the bombing. It was the arrival of long-range escort fighters. Howard did not fight much longer. He shot down another 110 near Brunswick at the end of January, and a Focke-Wulf over the same city in April, his 6th victory in Europe and 12th of the war counting China. Then he was sent home to train new pilots, which is what tended to happen to famous men. He ended up in business in St. Louis and later Florida, wrote a quiet memoir called Roar of the Tiger in 1991, and died in 1995 at 81. Kenneth Martin came home from prison camp in 1945 and rarely talked about any of it. Robert Travis was promoted after the war, went on commanding, and was killed in a B-29 crash in California in 1950. The base where it happened is called Travis Air Force Base. Galland survived, wrote his memoirs, and died in 1996. The Mustang itself, serial 43-6315, the one with the yellow characters under the cockpit, did not survive. Other pilots flew it after Howard went home. It was damaged past repair, and it was broken up for parts. None of the aircraft he flew in combat exist today. The story lasted and the aeroplane did not, which feels about right. 80 years on, Boxted and Dienathorpe are farmland. Oschersleben is a quiet town in Saxony-Anhalt, where a few very old people can still tell you about the day the sky filled with contrails and the factory by the railway burned. And somewhere in an American archive, there is a debriefing report, a few flat pages of official language, describing what Major James Howell Howard did on the morning of the 11th of January, 1944. It does not use the word hero anywhere. He would not have allowed it. The men who used that word were the ones in the bombers. They were the ones who came home and told everybody what they had seen, because they had spent 30 minutes watching a single fighter refuse to leave, and they knew perfectly well that they were only alive to tell it because of a man they had never met, and mostly never did,